Temidayo, and now I'll be presenting a paper titled Diabetes is Associated with Composite Cardiopulmonary Complications among COVID-19 patients. I have no disclosures and I am affiliated with Moore School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. So, COVID 19 has become a major global crisis, and reports have demonstrated cardiovascular complications, including sudden death, myocardial infarction, and arrhythmias. Patients who have cardiovascular disease tend to have these cardiovascular complications. Now, diabetes has been linked with poor outcomes in COVID patients, including respiratory failure, ARDS. However, cardiovascular complication in this subgroup has not been illustrated. Our study was approved by our institutional board review with a waiver for informed consent. We identified 126 patients with laboratory confirmed COVID. Among these patients, 54% had COVID coexisting with diabetes, while 46% had COVID alone. We compared demographics on baseline comorbidities and study outcomes between patients with diabetes and patients without diabetes. Our study outcomes included acute decompensated heart failure, acute myocarditis, acute myocardial infarction, new onset atrial fibrillation, and composite cardiopulmonary endpoints. Acute heart decompensated heart failure was a clinical diagnosis that was diagnosed based on people who had volume overload, signs of systolic or diastolic dysfunction. Acute myocarditis was defined based on elevated troponin high over the upper limit of normal. Acute myocardial infarction was defined by the fourth universal definition of myocardial infarction. Acute new onset atrial fibrillation was defined based on EKG changes, and composite cardiopulmonary endpoints was defined by cardiovascular outcomes that was listed above, plus ARDS. Multivariate logistical regression was used to estimate the adjusted odds ratio for the study outcomes in patients with COVID and diabetes compared to those with COVID alone. The mean age of our study sample was 62 years, plus or minus 14, and the baseline demographic and comorbidities is in table 1 here. The pertinent thing that you need to know is that patients with diabetes are more likely to have comorbidities, including hypertension. Now, for our study outcomes, the unadjusted study outcomes, acute heart failure, acute myocarditis, acute myocardial infarction, and composite cardiopulmonary endpoints were significantly higher in patients with diabetes mellitus. In the hierarchical logistic regression, acute heart failure, acute myocarditis, acute myocardial infarction, and composite cardiopulmonary endpoints remained statistically significant. Acute decompensated heart failure was 7 times higher in diabetes patients compared to those without diabetes. Acute myocardial infarction was 4 times higher in diabetes patients compared to those without diabetes, while composite cardiopulmonary endpoint was 3 times higher in those with diabetes compared to those without diabetes. And this study, this result was after controlling for relevant confounding variables in diabetes patients. And this is likely due to the higher comorbidities and exaggerated immunologic response in diabetes patients compared to those without diabetes. Now, our study must be interpreted in light of some limitations. One, over 80% of our study population were African Americans, thus limiting the generalizability of our study, and also our study sample was very small. In conclusion, diabetes is associated with worse cardiopulmonary outcomes, and further research is needed to understand the pathophysiological mechanism of the disease process in diabetes and to devise treatment strategies to mitigate complications. Thank you.